Okay, hello everyone. This is a video recording for our Chapter 3 unit on collectivism. And this PowerPoint presentation is already shared with you in your Google Classroom, so you should have it there along with the student notes. And for these early videos, you might find that the volume is a bit tough. It's still getting adjusted, but you can just go ahead and adjust that through your volume settings on your own video just to be able to hear better. Okay, so Chapter 3, Exploring Collectivism. So the key issue in the textbook is to what extent should we embrace an ideology? The related issue here is, should ideology be the foundation of identity? The specific chapter issue here is, should the values of collectivism shape an ideology? And so we'll be focusing mostly or almost entirely just on collectivism. Some of the key questions here that we have are, what are some key understandings of collectivism? How are the values of collectivism expressed politically, economically, and socially? So hopefully by the end of this chapter, by the end of this video, you'll have some answers to those questions. Okay, so moving on. Understandings of collectivism. So a collective is just a group of people, all right, and they organize themselves in a variety of ways. So if we see on the PowerPoint here, some of these organizations, or some of the ways that they organize themselves, are similar to the organizations of nation that you would have learned in Social 20. So we have ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and then, some more specific or ancient forms of collectives. We have, the tribe, more, or kind of throughout time, we have family. It's essentially just a group of people working together. Okay, and the ideology of collectivism emphasizes that the role of human interdependence, it emphasizes the role of human interdependence in society. So, we don't live in isolation, and, to an extent, we're just really not built for that. A good example is even within the prison system, the worst thing you can do to a prisoner, someone who misbehaves even while they're in prison, is to isolate them, right? So it's a really good example of how humans are just not built for being isolated. And moving on, so collectivism, it's the idea that we depend on one another in many ways. Okay, and then that this interdependence leads to increased happiness and fulfillment. So you'll see this little pointer at the bottom. So modern society is the acceptance of wide-scale collectivism. With the sheer number of people, we just have to be collectivists to an extent. If everybody went off and did whatever they wanted to do all the time, it would just create a lot of problems within society. Okay, so looking at kind of the Aboriginal perspective as well, because it's a big part of our curriculum, big part of our studies here in Alberta and in Canada. So some of the values and traditions of Aboriginal people also reflect this ideology of collectivism. So we have concern for the common good when dealing with issues such as land management, community decision making, educating and raising children. An example that I can think of, I've heard of, you have Indigenous groups who would gather their elders or leaders of the tribe, and when they would make a decision, they would take into account, several generations ahead. So they're really thinking about not only themselves, but their progeny, their future progeny. Okay, so, and again, we spend time learning in the other social classes as well about the relatedness and interconnectedness within Indigenous ideologies. So whether it's people, objects, land, identity comes from connections. Okay, so the quality of relations with others determines your comfortability, and that humans are not the most important beings in the world, and amassing wealth is important for the good of the community. Okay, and so when we continue to look at collectivism, some of the ideals, we'll see that this reflects really well even in Western ideologies as well. There's a link here you can check out if you want about some more information on that. Okay, so moving over to more of the Western style ideology as well. So name we should be familiar with, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, shortened down just to Rousseau. So he has an essay called The Social Contract, and he's explaining how each individual living in society, we all have these social contracts to one another. Okay. According to Rousseau, individuals will voluntarily give up their own self-interest to follow the collective will of society. So, there's a variety of examples that you can think of social contracts. Some are written, some are not written, or some are very visible and obvious, and others are not, right? So, one example that I would give is, if you've ever been on a road, you'll see there are lines on the road. And that thin layer of paint is a social contract that we accept. And we accept that we won't cross these at inappropriate times and places. Right? So that's that's a social contract. Some other social contracts, just a behavior, right? When someone's talking, you listen, you take turns doing that, so on and so on. Okay, so the general will, again, building on collective will or the general will is to promote the common good, liberty and equality among individuals. It applies to everyone equally because everyone has chosen it. So again, he's referring to the social contract, right? So we all agree to accepting this social contract. Therefore, it's a statement. It applies to everyone equally. Okay. Some questions there at the end that I would ask or have you think about is, is this really the case historically? Where the social contract applies to everyone equally? And then, just in terms of collectivist societies and whatnot, or even within the social contract, how do you deal with people who are greedy or too self-interested, right? Because it's not obvious how to deal with those type of people. So some of the political expressions of collectivism. So again, Rousseau's ideas of the social contract, they've informed the development of modern democracy, but also of socialism and communism. So Thomas Hobbes, who also to an extent wrote on the social contract, him and Rousseau and whatnot, but he believed that individuals living in a society had a social contract with one another as well. But unlike Rousseau, he's a little bit more pessimistic. So keep in mind, Thomas Hobbes lived during the English Civil War. And so this is a war fought between the Parliament and the King for control and for essentially over power and roles and responsibility of the King. Right. So the King was overextending his reach, and he's taxing quite a bit for raising an army. And so, the Civil War breaks out over this power struggle. So keep in mind, that's the context of Hobbes at the time he lived. He witnesses that. I believe he was a firsthand witness to the execution of the king as well. So naturally, he has a more pessimistic view of human character. And again, you can go back to those chapter 1 notes on Hobbes just for a little bit more information. So again, his argument is that we live in a society and under a government due to the protection they can offer us. If we were to live outside of society and government, or a king in his case, life would be nasty and brutish. So to Hobbes, the government governs in everyone's interest. Okay, so just kind of summarizing that is, again, he believes that the reason why we form these collective societies and these groups of people is so that we can gain the protection of a supreme ruler, right? Hobbes is really big on supreme rulers, right? His book Leviathan refers to the ruler, and it's a reference to like this ancient creature that's like a biblical reference, but we won't go into that. And, question here. So do you agree that the government looks out for everyone's interest? Like everyone? Or is it just kind of looking out for the broader general interest and what they think is best for everyone? And, given the times right now, COVID is a really good example of examining whose interests is the government looking out for. Okay, a little bit more info on Hobbes' views there. There's a link. Okay, some other political expressions of collectivism. Now, this when we talk about Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto, we're going a little bit to the more extreme end of collectivism, more so towards communism, and we'll look more at that in Unit 2 and whatnot. But just to give you a little taste of Karl Marx and his ideas, so he wrote the Communist Manifesto. So he believes that capitalism created poor living and working conditions for working class people. His proposition is to create a classless society where the workers, or the proletariat, they band together and overthrow the bourgeoisie, who are the factory owners. Okay, so again, taking control of industries and property. Marx believes that all property should be shared for the common good and not for the good of a select few. So he's really against the idea of private property. He's more of a public property guy. Okay, some questions there. So, what assumptions does Marx make about the general population? So is he over assuming the competency of individuals and that, the workers are capable of actually running and managing a company or factory, let's say? What are your assumptions about managers and owners? Think of your own boss as well. Do you think that you could do their job? Do you think you could do their whole job? Are you even aware of it? Or, are there things you can do and things you can't do? Is it something that's particularly difficult? And, you think maybe you'll have to go and study for the skills to be able to do their job? Consider some of these things. So there's a video here that please take the time to watch. I'm not going to play it in this just due to various issues that'll come up, but take time to watch this. But there are some notes on it. Oh, okay. So the notes on this video. So Marx, he's a German philosopher, and he presents a conflict theory. So societies are in conflict with each other. You have the poor versus the rich, which he classified as proletariat and bourgeoisie. And again, bourgeoisie also refers to factory owners, right? Private property owners. It's both a political and economic theory. And he viewed his theories as a leveler opposite to capitalism. Again, he's trying to level out the playing field and bring balance to life. Okay, so he formed his theories during the Industrial Revolution, in which, we have, and you can follow this link, but the Enclosure Acts, which changed the legal status of common land and forced people to live in cities. People could not pursue their interests in common land, forcing them to work in factories and cities. So again, this idea that property is now privatized and certain people own land to the point where, they and during the Industrial Revolution, due to technological advancements, you don't need as many people working on your field for your farm. And so a lot of these people have to leave and find, employment elsewhere. So they go towards cities and they have to work in factories. And, there are other issues. We'll talk about the Industrial Revolution later on that kind of build into this, but it's good enough for now. He argues that factory owners didn't want to pay or treat their workers fairly. They used children for cheaper labor. He feels that capitalism encourages inequality, so the rich need someone to do the work they don't want to do. Okay, and he believes change happens through revolution and requires education and personal development. So, Karl Marx is a big revolution guy, right? He wants the governments or ruling classes to be overthrown. To an extent, he believes, if you have to do it violently, then do it violently, right? Whatever you need to do to create that classless society. Okay, so again, watch that video, and maybe you'll pick up on things in that video. It's kind of presented in a interesting, fun manner as well. So yeah, give it a watch. There's also another video on Karl Marx to get more specific, and in this presentation I will present that as well. But yeah, go watch this video as well. It's very useful information. But here, so The notes on that video is, again, so Karl Marx and his ideas are often dismissed because they were used in the Soviet Russia and communist China, and they had very poor results. They believe that we should use the critiques that Karl Marx presents as a guide to capitalism's ills. Okay, so he was involved with communists to overthrow the class system and abolition of private property. Again, that's a very extreme collectivist idea that is more of a communist thing, especially when it comes to overthrowing and maybe doing so violently. So his criticisms include work is alienating. So work is too specialized, so people just don't see themselves and the contribution in their work. He was really big on the idea that if you're just doing this small task and just creating 1 out of 10 pieces of let's say a product, you don't really see yourself in that work. You're just creating this one small thing and building into this giant machine, and you're just a cog. Okay, so for that reason, work is alienating. Work is insecure, so humans are expendable in a capitalist economy through technology or budget cuts. So again, this is also a critique of the idea that within capitalism you have competition, and so the idea that owners want to maximize their profits, and so if they need to, let's say, even now we see at McDonald's, they're coming out with digital machines, and so you don't need a cashier, right? So again, emphasizing the point that Marx makes, that work is insecure, right? So you could just be replaced through competition, technology, or just budget cuts. Workers are paid little, so again, capitalists skim the workers' pay to increase profit, and he believes that profit is theft or exploitation of the worker. Okay, so he certainly believes that the people who work for the company should participate in the profits gained, not just the owners and the CEOs and the elites. Okay, he also believes that capitalism is unstable, that's characterized by crisis, explained away as freakish and rare, caused by overproduction and abundance. Okay, believes the abundance means few of us need to work, and that this is demonized. This idea of like being jobless is demonized by the term unemployment. Okay, so again, emphasizing that leisure is seen as laziness, when in reality, his goal is to create a society where we've advanced ourselves enough to the point where we only have to work if we want to, not because we need to. Okay, capitalism is bad for capitalists. He says that they focus too much on financials, and it becomes the heart of their lives. Right. So again, the reference in the video here is that even marriages were made based off whether or not it was a good financial decision, or if you're marrying into a wealthy family. Then you also have commodity fetishism, where you're just too absorbed into the idea of like really nice things, whether it's clothing, cars, materials, possessions. He goes on to say that capitalism creates strange ideological beliefs, such as leisure equals laziness, we should be productive almost constantly. And to Karl Marx's ideal future is that there's no private property or inherited wealth. There's steep income tax, centralized banking, communication, transport industry. So again, that just means that government owned or publicly owned, and then free public education. The video does that at the end, kind of a funny little bit of information. So Marx's works, all of his books and whatnot, they were paid for by his friend Frederick Engel's father, who owned a factory, right? So the irony there of capitalism is paying for a communism here, right? And the video just summarizes by saying he pointed out some worthy problems within capitalism, but did not per se provide solutions to those problems. he believes we need to change the world, right? But he doesn't have a direct answer to how to do that. And just some questions that I had come up with after watching the video is, you should think about as well. So, he talks a lot about overthrowing the class system. But, how can we ensure that after that's done, that the people who overthrew it don't fall into the same traps or flaws of the people before them, right? So it's easy to critique a factory owner or business owner and say, hey, you're scamming your workers. But, once you get into that position, you see how difficult it may be to have a profitable business and, the amount of work that goes into it. Would you be able to avoid this idea of taking in more money for yourself, more of that profit for yourself, right? So again, consider that. The idea is all wealth inherited, right? So, then you got to look at what defines wealth and whatnot. Is wealth just money? And if it is, well, should the money that people earn or inherit from their parents or whatnot, should that be given to the children? Do you have a right to your parents and their fortunes, or should that be spread amongst the people? And what about in terms of competency? Like maybe you come up with a company and some of the wealth that you have is not inherited but rather earned, right? So consider that as well, because obviously there are people who are more hardworking than others. You probably see that in school, and you probably see that in life as well. Last little point that I had there is, are some people just better at constructing a future for them to aim towards, right? So maybe somebody from a young age knows very well, like, hey, I want to be a doctor, and I know that I need to work hard to do that, and I know what I need to do. And so they have a vision for the future, and they're able to aim at this and succeed. And so, obviously the hard work they put in results in having a career that that's a very high income. And then some questions just regarding maybe Adam Smith and capitalism. And, we looked a little bit of that in chapter 2, but, were the ideals of capitalism founded around naive understandings of human nature, or is it easier to be greedy or to hoard wealth rather than share it, right? So consider, was Adam Smith a little bit naive about his thoughts on humans and, their willingness to share, right? Or is it just kind of easier? We see this quite a bit, this hoarding within society, right? People hoard various things, but some questions to consider. Okay, so some of the fundamentals of collectivism. First aspect is collective interest. Okay, and this is fundamental within collectivist society. So it's essentially a goal or ideal that all the members pursue. This interest, this collective interest, will benefit the group as a whole, and it might involve sacrificing a little bit of your personal goals and interests. Okay, so the encouragement of individual success, or the only individual success that's encouraged, is the one that also benefits the collective, right? So maybe you're able to contribute extra hours into a project, and your group finishes on time. So the collective interest being finishing that project on time and doing well, and your self-interest of trying to get that done, put in the extra hours, right? It's like you really need to benefit the collective, right? Rather than, let's say, you put in those extra hours and you let the teacher or professor know, like, hey, I spent this extra time to get this job done, and I should be rewarded a little bit more than my group members. Okay, and in that case, in certain collectivist societies, that expression of self-interest could be looked down upon or could be punished. Again, and building, this idea that collective interest also fuels social movements, lobby groups, human rights groups, different professional groups or unions and organizations, right? So, you can even think of like, let's say like Black Lives Matter, right? So the collective interest of society to improve the treatment of a specific group of people within society, right? So it's fueling a social movement. So that's a good example there. The question I pointed out here, so keep in mind, collectives simply refer to groups of people. Which groups' interests are being promoted and why? That's really specifically referring to lobby groups and this is more common in America, but there are lobby groups that are lobbying for things that have the collective interest of corporations in mind, let's say. And unfortunately, I don't have any specific examples, but it wouldn't be too hard to find these examples. So keep in mind, these social movements, lobby groups, and whatnot. Whose interests are they really promoting? Another major aspect here, we have collective responsibility. So collective responsibility involves taking responsibility for the actions of all members, okay? And the notion that individuals have a responsibility towards a group rather than to themselves. So you behave accordingly because you represent your collective, your group of people, right? And as the group, you also to an extent take the responsibility for all the actions of your members. It said here that it can also be argued that collective responsibility stands on the shoulders of individual responsibility, right? So if each individual is adhering to the responsibilities that are set out for them, the rules, the things that they have to do, then they're also feeding into the collective responsibility, right? So then, think of some collective responsibilities you have in your life. This would be a in-class assignment, but we'll just, this would be on a basis of in person. So ignore this for now in the video. Okay, so now moving on to economic expressions of collectivism. So the roots of economic collectivism extend all the way back to the Industrial Revolution with increases in technology, okay, and the expansion of the middle class. So what's going on is, and this gets explained better in Unit 2, but eventually with the Industrial Revolution and production increasing and manufacturing increasing, all of a sudden the amount of wealth there is in society also goes up. There's more jobs, there's a variety of jobs, different tasks, and people are getting paid for this. There's more things to buy, there's more things to sell, right? All of this is increasing the amount of money available. So you see the rise of this middle class within society, right? So now rather than having super rich elite or nobles and just peasants, we're starting to see that bourgeoisie class as defined by the ancient regime in France, right? I'm not talking about bourgeoisie as Karl Marx would define it, but some of those richer upper class peasantry are now gaining more money. They have a little bit more means now. Okay, but some of the issues that collectivism has with this whole process is that as some begin to acquire more wealth, right, so as the middle class begins to grow, that upper elite class is just increasing the gap between them and the lower ends of the economic ladder, right? And so, that's not keeping collectives in mind. We begin to see a growing concern for economic equality over the last 200 to 400 years. So, for sure in the last 200 years, right? So about the 1800s and onwards, but prior to that, it's a little bit, it's not as well articulated. Okay. And then some questions here, some things for you to think about is, what are your thoughts on the causes of economic inequality? Specifically, let's say something like wage gaps, right? Like why do some people earn more? So for example, there's a big discussion going on of the gender wage gap. What are some factors that lead to men making more than women, right? So these are some things to consider, right? And this is a age-old discussion, right? Why is someone at the upper end of society making more than someone at the lower end, right? So consider, take time to think about that. Again, so why do some people have more than others, right? So again, think about the doctor example. This person in the short term might not have had as much money as some of their friends, but in the long term, after they're done their studies, they start their career just making significantly higher amounts of money than their friends are making, right? So let's say like a mechanic, right? A mechanic, you finish in 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years, you're making 40, 50 grand a month, maybe a little bit more depending on just the negotiation you've done. Whereas your doctor friend in those first 4 years just finished their first degree and they're now going to med school, and then they have to specialize. So you get 4, 5, 6 years where you're working, earning a pretty steady paycheck while they're still a student, but that person who's working hard and kind of holding off on some of that the gratification or reward, when they do graduate, all of a sudden maybe that person's making $400,000 a year, right? So again, right, so just looking into some of those examples of why some people make more than others, right? Other economic expressions of collectivism, so taxes, big one, right? So all Canadians are expected to pay taxes. The money that the government accumulates is utilized for various social programs, general operations, maintenance of the nation. Okay, so Canada, just like many other countries, finds itself in an economic middle ground between collectivism and individualism, right? And so we have a little bit of free markets, a little bit of public markets as well, or public corporations, crown corporations. We'll learn about those later. We tax people for certain things and tax them less for other things, right? So we're in the middle, really, as are most countries. Here's a little just slide I added in just to look at taxes. So, these are this is taken from the federal Canadian website, and it talks a little bit about tax percentages and brackets. So just to help you better understand, here's some math as well. So the way this works is that if you're Canadian and you make let's say you make under $49,000, on that first $49,000 you are taxed 15%, okay, which would be $7,353. Now if you're let's say a rather well-off person and you're making $98,000 a year, so after the first 49,000 and up to the next 49,000, so if you add those together, you get $98,040. That second bit of money there is taxed at a 20.5% rate, which would be $10,000.49. Sorry, $10,049.10. Altogether, you have $17,402 of taxes as taken out of $98,000. Okay, so that, and just to clarify, these tax brackets, they don't work this way. You don't add these percentages. Okay, you take a certain percentage out of the first portion of income and a different percentage out of that second portion of income that's on top of the first. Okay, so you're not taking 35.5% interest, or sorry, taxes. Okay, just to make that clear. And on this side, we see just how the government spends money. This is an example from 2016, 2017. So we see public debt, so paying off debt, major transfers to persons, transfer payments. It's a little bit more confusing in this chart, but if you go to this website, there's a really good article on how the money is spent and broken down. So again, like 8.2% national defense. So that's like military spending and whatnot. All right. So take a look at this link. It's pretty good stuff. I added this in just to contrast, in America, right? So this is discretionary spending. So the way this works is that this is a portion of the budget that the president requests and Congress will appropriate or approve every year. And this is less than a third of the total federal budget. Okay, so this is just, less than 1/3 of the total federal budget mandatory spending accounts for around 2/3. Okay, so we see here this huge chunk of cash, 598.5 billion. 54% of their discretionary spending is just being spent on military. Right, so just kind of comparing and contrasting as well the differences between Canadian and American economic collectivism, let's say, right? So what are we really spending our money on? But I will add, though, with this, the reason, at least part of why America's military budget is so high is because, a lot of other countries, Canada included, have opted away from developing their own military because, we can rely on America, right? So it's, to an extent, it's kind of necessary that they're spending that much money. So again, just re-emphasizing the idea that public property is a collectivist, socialist, or communist ideal, right? Opposite to capitalism and individualism of private property, right? These are contrasting. Public property is anything; it's just property that is not owned by an individual or a group of individuals or a corporation. Typically, though, the way it ends up working out is that this public property is owned and managed by the state, right? And that was certainly the case in Soviet Russia and to an extent China as well, right? And even most other countries that are more of a liberal individualist society or capitalist, they still have an extent of public property. Okay, so in a communist state, it is possible that all industries are public property, controlled and managed by the state for the common good or collective. Right. And again, referring to Karl Marx here, so he, in his idea of a collectivist ideology, so Marx and collectivist ideology argue workers should profit from their labor and therefore should also be the owners of such factories. Right, so some collectivists might argue that having a stake in the company will garner more interest in the company's endeavors, meaning like if you're part of the ownership and you kind of gain from the profits as well, if that's the case, you will be more interested in what the company does and the success of the company. Some questions that arose is, how do we determine the common good? Right? Like, how do we know what's best for us and what's best for all of us? Right? Is it inherently known? Do we just kind of know this, or do we have to, think about this quite a bit? Right? Do we have to ponder upon this? And is it easy to figure out what is the common good? Think about it in your own life. Like, is it easy for you to figure out what is best for you to do? Right? And as you get older, you'll have a better understanding of the complexity of that question as well. The other idea as well, so with this idea of like public property and like, oh, it should be owned by everyone. Well, do we naturally aim towards leadership? So even if it was public and all of the workers own the company, would they still elect a leader to sort of guide them? Right? Would they naturally follow that person? Okay, and then especially if that person is very competent, really good at their job and articulate, they really know how to speak well and express their ideas well. Or, just a person who's very fair and equitable, right? Someone you can trust, right? Do we just naturally kind of lean towards following them, having them as leaders? So, kind of contrasting the ideas of collectivism of that we should all be a part of the committee, the team that decides. Well, are we just going to pick one person anyways and let them lead us? Okay, and this last one's a little bit more abstract, but how can we determine interest, right? So think about the things in your life that you're very interested in, right? You're very compelled to kind of focus and listen and watch or observe, whatever it is, right? Could be a sport, could be a hobby, could be, anything, right? How do we determine that? right? It's especially easier to understand the opposite when you're not interested in something. It's very difficult to pay attention to it, to be focused on it, and to want to do it, right? So thinking about that, ask yourself, is it possible for everyone to work in a field in which they're interested in, right? Is it possible to find a job for every single person on the planet that they actually like doing, right? Or is there going to have to be some sacrifices made? Okay, and here we have some criticisms of kind of this public property stuff and economic expressions of collectivism, but some criticisms that come up is that the idea and premise of public property presents an unrealistic view on human nature. The idea that when you bring large groups of people together, excuse me, the idea that when you bring large groups of people together, motivation can be low because the individual impact is also low. Okay, the feeling that the individual makes little difference. Okay, so, and if there's any other criticisms that you can come up with on kind of the ideal set out by economic collectivism and public property and public ownership, right? What are some flaws you see in that? Again, switching gears a little bit more to the Canadian aspect, but in Canada we have things like crown corporations and crown land, and these are just so crown land is just large areas of land that the government owns now. Crown corporations are companies that serve the common good, and these companies were typically making infrastructure, let's say, or essential resources, right? They're maybe like a mining company for precious minerals or gases and oil and whatnot, or utilities as well. So like having a crown corporation for the electricity and heating and water and whatnot. Other examples are parks, schools, hospitals, roads. It's just property that the government manages in the interest of the public, right? So ensuring that everybody can get equal access and equitable prices, and not having to worry about a competitive company coming in and saying like, hey, if you want the best service, you got to pay really high, and if you don't have the money, well, too bad, you just get lower quality service. These properties are maintained with public money, so we have some examples of crown land, so Banff, Jasper, Elk Island, Waterton, right? These areas, these national parks and whatnot. There's 48 of these within Canada, these national parks, right? But they're operated and kind of maintained through public money, right? So taxes. Some crown corporations include Canadian Dairy Commission, with Canada Post, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, so CBC. Okay, and then here's some more information on those, some links. Are there any, again, questions? So are there any benefits to government ownership and management of property? Oh, excuse me. Can you think of any of these benefits? So kind of brainstorm that. What are some drawbacks? What are some of the problems that go with having public land or public corporations, right? Okay, so continuing on. So the eventually what happens with when you have mixed economies is you have this privatization that occurs, and that refers to the transfer of property or resources from public and government control to private control. So again, allowing, let's say, so there's a good example is Petro-Canada, the gas company. So it used to be more of a crown corporation run and operated by the government, but maybe 30, 40 years ago, they started to privatize and give up control away from the government, and so on and so forth. But you don't necessarily need to look into that, right? So that's privatization. So collectivist governments do not support the privatization of natural resources, whereas individualists would support the privatization of resources. Typically, most governments find themselves in the middle, as was mentioned before. Uh, in Canada, private businesses extract natural resources such as oil, gas, lumber, and these industries, these companies play a significant role in our national economy, allowing us both direct and indirect benefits. Right. So when gas prices are up, the economy is booming. That's very that's a rhetoric that's very common in Alberta. BC and northern Alberta is also known for the lumber industry as well, right? So we do benefit from this. And ask yourself, are there any resources you think should always be public, should always be equal access? And on the flip side, are there things that we should always keep private because we want competition and innovation in those fields? There's a really good example on page 83 and 84 that you can read as well. And if you do choose to read it, well, consider the difference between owning a resource and owning the rights to distribute a resource. Okay, there's a distinction there. Factor in that this agreement wasn't necessarily for the privatization of distributing water as a corporation, but an attempt at providing citizens with reliable infrastructure of receiving water. Okay, so again, if you're reading the source, you'll understand what I'm talking about here. And then there's a question here, what could Bechtel have improved upon given the information we have in this example? Okay, so I would really take the time to read that. It's not a very long read, but it does pose an interesting dilemma of privatizing certain resources and how to go about doing that. Okay, so now we're looking at some of the more social expressions of collectivism. Okay, so again, one of the three main headings and the last one. So cooperation is the ability to work together to achieve common goals. It is typically something learned from an early age, and it transcends playing games and sports, working on projects. Cooperation is just a basic human skill of socialization, and something that is essential to the success of an individual. Okay, so I'm sure we can all think of examples of you're playing a game, whether it was in school or outside, and somebody that you're playing with is cheating, right? Kids do this all the time in dodgeball, right? So cooperation and adherence to some of the rules and some of the norms set out. When people break those, you're kind of socially ostracized, right? People don't want to be with you, right? So again, cooperation is it's a social expression of collectivism, but it's really just a human expression, right? It's seen on both sides. Even in a very individualistic society, if you aren't good at cooperating, well, people won't want to be your friend, right? So do consider things like that. And as I mentioned there, if you don't learn to cooperate and integrate with society, it can lead to your exclusion. And there's the question there at the end. Now, within collectivism, so the cooperation leads to collective responsibility, right? This can also be built off collective interest, and we talked about this before as well. So it's just responsibility to the group, and how the group is responsible for the actions of its individuals as well, right? So there's a relationship between the two. Okay, then you also have your collective responsibility, both politically and socially. So maybe in terms of like lawmaking and whatnot, or certain laws that the government's trying to pass, and then socially, if you see things that you think aren't right morally or ethically, right? And then some examples here to think of. So when you go to work, you have your individual responsibilities. Okay, whatever your task is. When you manage to fulfill these responsibilities, you help to forward the collective agenda, right? So maybe you work at a restaurant, and maybe you have to cook food, right, and make sure there's enough supply of cooked food so that when customers come in, you can make their food quickly, or if you're a cashier and having enough money and coins inside the cash register so that you can properly deal with change. uh, so when you're upholding your individual responsibility, you also forward the collective agenda, the collective interest and goal, right, of operating that business or that area successfully. Okay, when you fulfill your responsibility successfully and competently, when you do a good job, you are rewarded, right? Typically, right? Maybe that's just acknowledgement. Maybe it's a good grade. Maybe it's a raise. You get an extra dollar per hour, right? So really think about what happens to systems that do not reward competency when people are doing their job well, right? So what goes on then? How would you feel, if you worked for your boss and you did an awesome job and you did that for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they just choose not to reward you in any way? How would you feel about that? And there's some a little bit more there that you can read as well and consider. Okay, so social expressions of collectivism again. So with collective responsibility and interest and whatnot, you also have collective norms, and adhering or following them as well goes hand in hand with collective responsibility and collective interest. So collective norms are just a set of accepted behaviors and values being promoted by the group. Okay, so some might find guidance in these, while others might feel pressured by these norms. Okay, so let's say like a collective norm of, let's just say, when you're walking in the hallway, you don't bump people in the shoulder, right? Especially amongst boys and men, that can be, it can potentially start a physical altercation. So, you have this collective norm that when you're walking, you don't hit each other. Okay, so some people might be guided by that and realize like, oh wow, when I'm walking the hallway, I should make sure that I'm not stepping into other people's space. Whereas other people might think like, hey, wherever I'm walking, people should just get out of the way, right? So if they hit me, that's their fault. They should have got out of my way, right? So we see kind of the parameters of these collective norms. And again, like following these norms, it might require us to support or make decisions that adhering to collective norms can require us to support or make decisions that respect societal expectations, which may not reflect our own personal beliefs. So again, if you're the person who thinks that, okay, if I'm walking, you better get out of the way, right? You're going against the collective norm, so if you choose to accept that collective norm, you're going against your own personal beliefs. Okay, and if that collective norm, if that kind of accepted societal behavior is too far from our own ideals or values, it can cause us to reject these norms, which can result in punishment or rejection from the social group. Right, and you can think of how we deal with people who break various laws. Okay, last slide. Chapter 3 takeaways. So important notes from this, things that you should really try to integrate in your understanding of collectivism for this chapter and end of the unit, is that collectivism has almost always existed to some extent, right? So we're looking at tribal societies that would work together to hunt and survive, and to an extent not even ancient, right? Even in Canada, just 200, 300 years ago, which is not a long time ago, you had these tribal societies that were working as collectives to survive, right? You then switch over to agrarian societies, so that's just farming societies. So rather than being nomadic and constantly following animals and hunting to survive, instead you are now farming, right? You settle down to a specific area, and your population grows, right? Well, now you need to adjust your understanding of collectivism to a different kind of ideal, because now you have a city, you have a boundary as well, right? You have your territory. Okay, so societies would come together for both protection and the age-old struggle for survival, right? So, having food doesn't change just because, you're farming, right? You still have to grow it successfully. You probably still have to hunt as well. Eventually, collectivism is made into a formal ideology and way of life, the ideals of which are collective responsibility, collective interest, cooperation, economic equality, adherence to collective norms, and public property. Okay, so those are all 6 points that you can utilize on your written response assignments, and just information you'll need moving forward in this course. Okay, so that is all the slides. I hope that this presentation helped. I hope that it was beneficial to you. Take the time to watch it, watch the videos. If you have feedback, just let me know. Email me, leave a comment. Thank you. Goodbye.